This video is going to be a walkthrough on how to use the Wild Credit platform to borrow assets. So we'll start by jumping into the app. And the first screen we get taken to is the borrow screen. So this screen summarizes the assets that we can borrow through the Wild Credit platform. We can see the range of assets on this left side here, the associated borrowing rate for each of those assets, as well as the liquidity mining rewards that are attached to each of these assets. So as part of this walkthrough, I'm going to be borrowing USDC. So I'll click USDC. Now, broadly from a design perspective, Wild Credit uses an isolated lending pool design. Now, I won't get into the details of that. I've explained it in the walkthrough on how to lend out your assets. So I'll include a link there, which you can dive into and really understand the background of the difference between isolated lending pools versus diversified lending pools. So back to this screen here, now that we've clicked on the asset that we want to borrow, which is USDC, we now see the assets that have individual lending pools associated with borrowing USDC, and we can see here that that's using Ethereum as collateral or as DAI as collateral. So as part of this walkthrough, we're going to be using Ethereum as collateral and borrowing USDC. So we'll click through to Ethereum. Now this is a screen where we're going to be able to execute the borrowing arrangement. Now before we dive into some of these inputs and metrics, I just want to call out this section down here, which highlights the ability to use Uniswap V3 positions as collateral to borrow against. Now I won't get into the details of that. I've also got another video that shows a walkthrough of how to use your Uniswap V3 position as collateral and borrow against it, and I'll include that in the comments section. So now diving into the actual inputs of this and metrics of this screen, we can see that this section here is where we're going to be able to add the amount of collateral that we want to borrow against, which is here, with the collateral being Ethereum as we chose before, and also set the amount that we want to borrow against that Ethereum in the form of USDC, again, which we chose in the previous screen. Now in this section here, once we get to a point where we want to repay the amount borrowed, we can click here and click repay, as well as withdraw that collateral. But I'll get into more detail when we actually want to execute a repayment. So jumping back to the borrowed section. Now if I wanted to use 7 Ethereum as my collateral and borrow against that, we can see some metrics showing up on the right hand side here. So before I actually go ahead and execute the amount that I want to, I'll jump in and I'll put an amount that I want to borrow. So I'll put $6,000 of USDC that I want to borrow, and then we'll talk through some of these metrics for context. So we can see where it says collateral, we're highlighting the amount of the asset that we're providing as collateral. So in this case, I'm putting forth 7 ETH. We can see that as part of this arrangement, I'm going to be borrowing $6,000 with a max borrowing capacity of $11,000. Now that max borrowing capacity is set based off this safety ratio, which I'll get to shortly. There's a current minimum borrowing amount set by the platform at 5,000 ETH, and we can see that because we've got the 6,000 ETH, we're exceeding that, so we can go ahead and execute the borrowing that amount. An important feature as well is understanding the reserves of the assets within the Ethereum and USDC lending pool. So we can see currently the reserves are 27,000 ETH, 27,000 USDC with 11.5 Ethereum. So typically in money market platforms, we can only borrow to the amount that is available within the reserves. And if we are looking to borrow large portions of that reserve, we will get stung with higher interest rates. So we can see that when I'm looking to borrow $6,000 of the 27,000 USDC, that's equating to a borrowing cost of 6.5%. And if I'm looking to take out more, naturally that, as we were saying, if you're pulling more of that, of those reserves out, you are starting to, the interest rate formula will flow through into charging a higher interest rate. So if I jump back down to $6,000, again to the safety ratio, this is an adaptation of the loan to value ratio, and loan to value ratio being the size of your borrowing amount divided by the value of your collateral. And typically in money market platforms or lending platforms, when that loan to value ratio drops below goes above a certain amount, either by way of your borrowed assets increasing or your collateral decreasing, you can get to a liquidation event where the platform will liquidate your position to avoid any credit risk to lenders, and you'll get stung with a liquidation fee. Now that's similar to the Wild Credit platform, except to make it easier to understand that metric, a safety ratio essentially says, well, across the board, they're going to set, the platform sets currently a 60% loan to value ratio, and the safety ratio to use as your buffer or yardstick is essentially 1. So if your loan to value ratio increases, that will above 60%, that safety ratio will move below 1, which is indicative of being in a liquidation event environment. And when your loan to value ratio is below 60%, the safety ratio will equate to a number that's above 1. So we can see here, by using collateral of 7 with borrowing $6,000 against that, that works out to a safety ratio of 1.8. And typically when I'm dealing with volatile assets as opposed to stable coins, like in this example with Ethereum being the volatile asset, I like to keep a safety ratio which is obviously a lot higher than 1 to account for the volatility and potential for that safety ratio to fluctuate. So that 1.8 gives me enough sort of buffer based on how I think about the volatility of the Ethereum asset. Now I touched on this earlier, but we've got our rates here. Now I touched on the borrowing rate that will be charged at this point in time, and that's a variable rate, so that will fluctuate depending on how much reserves are being taken out from other borrowers, as well as how much assets are being supplied from the lender side as well. So at this point in time, it's 6.5%. Now, because we're providing collateral similar to most other money market platforms, we are also getting a supply side or lending interest rate earned on that collateral too, which is currently 0.2%. Now, the platform also has liquidity mining rewards in place for particular lending pools, and that's where this wild reward line comes into play. But for this particular lending pool, the Ethereum USDC lending pool, there are no liquidity mining rewards attached to that. So we'll go ahead and execute that transaction. So now that that transaction has been executed, we can see, as I jump into the MetaMask wallet, we can see that $6,000, got a little bit more from that I had in there previously, but we can see that that $6,000 that I've borrowed is now sitting in my MetaMask account. Now from here, when we're playing around with wherever we're using that $6,000 and we come back to the Wild Credit platform, we can jump to the dashboard just to get a bird's eye view and see what our both our borrowed positions are, as well as our collateral that we've supplied as well. So we can see here that we've got two assets, Ethereum and USDC, which is indicative that we've provided collateral and borrowed through the Ethereum and USDC lending pool. Now we can see here that for Ethereum, we've got a positive number of the amount that we've provided as collateral, as well as a positive interest rate. Now the positive numbers are indicative that these are this is the collateral that we've provided into the lending pool. Now on the opposite side, we've got a negative amount as well as a negative interest rate, and those negatives are indicative that this is the amount and the asset that we've borrowed against our collateral. Now the last point here is we've got the safety ratio number, and that will change obviously over time as the price of Ethereum changes, but that gives you a nice sort of bird's eye view at your positions without having to jump into the deep sort of mechanics and other pages within the platform itself. Now, if we want to go ahead and repay that outstanding debt, we can click into the asset that we've borrowed. So in this case, it's USDC. And that'll take us back to this screen where we executed the borrowing arrangement. But if we want to repay, like I touched on earlier, instead of borrow, we'll have to click this repay section here. Now at this point, we've got two inputs. We've got the repay debt input with USDC now shown here, as well as our withdraw collateral input as well. So what we can do is I want to basically pay my outstanding debt in full, which is the $6,000, and I want to also withdraw my collateral. Now you can leave your collateral in there, which will continue to earn the supply rate received when you just simply lending out your assets through the platform. But if I want to now take that collateral and use it elsewhere within DeFi, I can do that in the one hit here. So repay and withdraw, we can go ahead and execute that. So I'll give permission to do so. Now let's execute that transaction. Now that transaction's been executed, we can see that our collateral is now to zero, as well as our borrowed amount is down to zero as well. Now if we jump back to the dashboard, we'll be able to see that now our position has been closed, and we now have no positions within the Wild Credit platform. Now finally, when we jump into our MetaMask, we can see that the $6,000 of USDC that we originally borrowed against our 7 ETH collateral has gone, and our 7 ETH collateral is now showing up back in the MetaMask wallet. And that's it for the walkthrough in terms of how to use Wild Credit to borrow assets. If you have any additional queries beyond this walkthrough, feel free to jump into the community, which will be able to help you with those queries.